Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you reside. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. It's a really important topic, a really important conversation. So today we're going to be discussing restorative justice, addressing racial and ethnic disparities that criminalize communities of color. This is brought together in partnership with Impact Justice, the Restorative Justice Project, JDAI Connect, RYSE Center, and the Juvenile Court in Davidson County in Tennessee. And so with that being said, really want to thank the Annie Casey Foundation for their support for the online community of JDAI. If you're interested in joining and be a part of this community, it's free, it's open. Please participate in discussions and finding different resources and tools to help improve the outcomes for our young folks, and especially young folks in the legal system. So with that, we have a couple of quick notes. So our webinar today, it'll be running 60 minutes. 40 minutes of that will be with this amazing group of presenters that we have. And the second part will be 20 minutes of questions. So if you have questions, please use the chat function and you can send your questions directly there. We'll be going through and harvesting and looking for some questions that we can share for discussion at the end. If you are having technical issues, you can email Brian Taylor, and his email is there. This, I don't know if you've noticed, but it is being recorded. And so if you're like, I missed something, what did they say? Or you have a question about something, you can come back to it. And we'll also be sharing the slides with you as well. And it'll be available on JDAI Connect. And this is a big topic that we're having right now, right? And we were here together for 60 minutes. So it's really, really, really important for us to continue the conversation. So if there's like something that comes to you afterwards, you're like, oh, but they said this, and like we can connect, and we can connect on JDI Connect and continue to have discussions with one another. So our presenters today, our speakers today, I am Ashley George. I'm with the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice, and the co-director of the Restorative Justice Project. And I'll pass it to Sia.
Hi, everyone. So I am Sia Henry. I am a senior program specialist with Impact Justice's Restorative Justice Project. So I work really closely with Ashley. Now I'll pass it to Stephanie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Medley. I'm the Director of Education and Justice at the RYSE Center in Richmond, California. And I'll turn it over to Judge Calloway.
Good afternoon or good morning to some. I am Sheila Calloway. I am the Juvenile Court Judge in Nashville, Tennessee. I have been one of the fortunate jurisdictions to have the opportunity to work with Impact Justice and the Restorative Justice Program. And I'm looking forward to being a part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And I also see in the chat, we have a lot of good afternoons, good mornings, folks welcoming one another. So I'm already feeling the warm embrace of this community. So thank you for joining us today. And thank you, presenters, for taking this time today. All right. So before we jump into our presentation, we want to start off with a video that can set the foundation and lay the framework so that we're all starting from the same page of understanding, like, how did we get to this place? So we have racial and ethnic disparities within our legal system, our youth, and our criminal legal system. How did we get here? So we're going to watch a brief film about that. And so with that, we're good to go.
When you walk into a facility, all that you see is a sea of Black and brown bodies.
Racial injustice is evident, within these youth prisons.
It's mostly African-American males. It's obvious.
It's hard to try to argue that it's not a racial justice issue.
You see these two white staff all of a sudden just rushing into the room. All of us just standing there and watching, my friend who was African-American, being beat down by the staff. I'm like, why'd you go and do that? And he's like, what do you care? He's like, at the end of the day, kid, you're only here to pay my paycheck. In that moment, I realized I was just seen as a dollar sign to this man.
I would define structural racism as a hierarchical inequity that is characterized by white supremacy.
If you have any questions about what structural racism looks like, I encourage you to walk into a juvenile prison in America, talk to the Black kids who are in those facilities, and ask them what their experience has been in the juvenile justice system.
When the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, it actually kept an exception for people who were convicted of a criminal offense. And so the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system became the new vehicle for controlling the lives of people of color.
After the Civil War ended and we saw this influx of African Americans exercising what they deemed as their freedom, immediately we saw institutions go up, these youth prisons be built to house young Black African American males.
Post-Emancipation Proclamation, you know, unfortunately as a whole, as a country, we thought it was our opportunity to do away with racism. We thought that we'd gotten past that particular issue. And through sharecropping, through Jim Crow, through segregation, the drug epidemic, we find that, you know, society, especially here in the U.S., we just reinvent that issue.
It's almost like it was meant to be. Like at no point in our history would Black males be completely free.
So Virginia is indeed the heart of the Confederacy. You can walk down on the James River and stand in the very place where Black lives were bought and sold. You can walk the slave trails.
Some states highlight the fact that their institutions have been around for hundreds of years. And that's certainly like a slap in the face for our brown and Black allies. And I think it's disgusting that a state would highlight the fact that their institution has been around so long on the heels of the end of slavery.
The Beaumont facility was built in 1890, and when they began incarcerating young people there, those young people had to work the land, much like slaves.
New Jersey happened to be the last northern state to abolish slavery. The New Jersey Training School for Boys was opened in 1867. That's 2 years after emancipation, after slaves were free. And they put a process in place called gradual emancipation, which meant that children who were born by slave mothers had to work as indentured slaves until they were young adults.
In Kansas, we're also the state of Brown versus Board of Education. To be able to go just a few miles from the Brown versus Board of Education school building to the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex, our one remaining youth prison, and walking in and seeing the racial disparities in that facility. Again, it's just difficult to walk away from that and not feel like we have a special responsibility to fix this and fix this quickly.
Our youth prisons were created at a time when human bondage was legal, a time when whites were willing to see Blacks as less than human. Young people will come into these facilities in leg irons and shackles. There's been incidents of correctional officers actually hog tying. Some facilities use something called a restraint chair. You know, everything that they do, they're being watched and they're being controlled, and they're being deprived of their own agency and their own worth.
When you look at some of the communities that are the highest committing to the juvenile justice system, they are impoverished communities. They are communities that are struggling economically. The school systems are failing, and there is a lack of hope and opportunity in those communities. And it is just a reflection of the way Blacks were treated when they were first brought to this country on slave ships.
And so we have a system right now, one system of justice for white youth and for upper middle class youth, and then one system of justice for poor youth and youth of color.
The kids know, they are aware that the color of their skin affects how they're going to be treated. I don't see people who look like me behind those bars. I don't know how you can say it isn't a racial justice issue.
I feel like the movement is ripe. The time is now for this message to get out that this is no longer just a juvenile justice issue, but a racial justice issue.
I see a sea of diverse faces who've come to a place because you, like me, know that change, when it happens, it always happens from the ground up in our communities.
My hope is that we can fight for a world where no young person is locked up, where young people have the opportunity to be their full self, where young people have the opportunity to live their destiny and to carry out their dreams. That's my hope.
As I watched that video over and over again, I had that same hope that one day I can walk to work or come into the building and go to the detention facility that I run and not see any youth in detention. And if I have to see youth in the detention, to see a more diverse group of youth in detention than what I see now. Today, when I walked into our building and there were about 18 youth in our facility, it's as that same video said, the majority were all Black and brown youth. In fact, there were only 2 non-Black and brown youth. And of the Black and brown youth, there were only 4 brown youth. And so literally out of 18 youth in the facility, the majority are Black boys. And it's a cycle of disparity that we all have seen and all have heard about. The question is, how does it happen and how do we stop that cycle? As you can see in the PowerPoint, minority communities are usually the communities that are more likely to be surveilled. And once you have that surveillance, the people in the community are more likely to be stopped by the police. And once they are stopped by the police, they are more likely to be arrested. And once they are arrested, they are more likely to be convicted. And once they are convicted, they are more likely to experience lengthy prison sentences. And this is not a surprise to, I'm sure, many of you all who are on the call today. But the question is why? And what can we do? As I think about that cycle, one of the questions, as I say, is why are minority communities subject to surveillance more? And I challenge all of us to have a talk with our police departments and ask, why is there more surveillance in this community versus another community? And is it true that it's because they are high crime areas? They're going to be high crime areas if there are more police in the area. I used to always argue with a couple of friends of mine that were in the police department and say, you cannot convince me that in our housing area in the east part of Nashville, that there are more home burglaries than there are in our more affluent neighborhoods in the community, out in the west area. There's no way you can convince me that there are more drugs in one part of the city than there are in another part of the city. And what it boils down to is if there are police in that area, it's going to be automatically a higher crime area. Now, one time I did have a police that had an answer for me that I wasn't expecting. What they said is, we patrol the places where we have more calls from. And so if they're in a particular area of our town, it's because they've received more phone calls about a need to be in that area of town. You think about that. Why are people calling? And is the answer to send more police, or could we send a restorative justice circle instead? And so we as a community have to come up with better answers of, it's just because police are called more that they're in those communities more. Because if they are in those communities more, they're going to be higher arrests. Now that's one cycle that we can definitely think about and know some ways that we can make a change. There are other cycles of disparity that we also have to be aware about. For instance, the cycle of disparities in school discipline. And I know most of you have already heard about the school to prison pipeline. It's a real thing and it happens on a regular basis. And so if you have a child in a school that has behavioral issues, what most studies show is that youth of color, minority youth, will be subjected to exclusionary discipline more than their counterparts. So a Black child who has behavioral issues will be either suspended from school or expelled from school, whereas a white child may end up just going to the office, going to a place to cool down, having some in-school suspension, but whatever they are, they're staying within the school system. So once you exclude a child from the school system, you are sending them a lot of times to places where there's no adult supervision, where there's no one around, or you're sending them straight to the streets. And when that happens, you're sending them to places where people like me work. That is our school to prison pipeline. It is real and it happens on a regular basis. And it is definitely a part of the cyclical nature of our disparities in our justice system. And when I think about the juvenile justice system, another big piece of the cyclical nature of disparities comes strictly from the child welfare cycle. So when you think about child abuse and child neglect cases, again, the racial disparity in most communities is desperate against minorities. When I think about, for instance, an early removal case, when a case of a potential child abuse, I like to give the example of a child abuse where in the area of Nashville, in a housing area, let's say, a child may be sleeping in the bed with their parent, roll off the bed, and break their arm. The parent may respond appropriately, do everything they can to get the child to the hospital, to have a welfare check, to see what needs to happen. And in our community, they're going to go to the hospital that's closest to their community. And the hospital that's closest to their community does not have a child trauma unit. And so once they are placed in that place, then they are removed and taken to the hospital on the other side of town that has a child trauma unit. And by the time they get there, their affect, their response to the fact that they're coming to the hospital, all of those things may be different from their initial time or initial appearance at a hospital. And so what normally happens when that second trip and that second interaction with another set of different doctors and specialists who are asking questions and a different attitude, there's usually a call to the child welfare system, the Department of Children's Services. And once there's that call, there's usually a removal. But if you're coming to the hospital, if you live in a more affluent part of the town and you come to the hospital and you already have that's your first initial response, and you respond in the way that they believe is appropriate, then there's more likelihood that they will say, oh, that was an accident. We don't need to call the child welfare system. And what we probably, most of us on this webinar know, that once you call the child welfare system, once there is a removal of that child, there is a stronger likelihood that that child will end up in the criminal justice system later in life. What the studies show is that from 0 to 5, removals lead to direct action into the criminal justice system later in life. That's what we affectionately call the cradle to prison pipeline. And the reason is because at that moment, the system is causing an adverse childhood experience for that child. And the system is a part of the different in brain development for that child because of the trauma. But then later on, the system doesn't do nearly enough to help that child to become resilient and to become successful in life, and instead leads that child to the criminal justice system. We have an opportunity to make a difference and make a change in our system. We have an opportunity to break these cycles. We can work together as a community. We can be more restorative on all of the things that we do. And we can help those youth and those, even the adults, that somehow come and connect with our system. We can do better. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Ashley George.
Thank you so much, Judge, for sharing your insight and your background and real stories of what happens to our young people and the disparities that you have witnessed because of our system. And so you mentioned, like, we can do something different. What if you don't call the police, who else can you call? Can you call a restorative justice person, right? And so now I want to talk to you all about restorative justice. Some of you may have heard the term before. This may be your first time. I'll do a very brief, high-level definition and understanding of restorative justice as we're talking about restorative justice and looking at racial and ethnic disparities within the legal system. So if you don't remember anything, when we talk about restorative justice, we're talking about relationships. That's the relationships. How do you form the relationships? How are the relationships sustained and nourished? And then this part, what do you do if a relationship or if a harm has occurred? How do you mend that relationship? And so when we're looking at restorative justice within the legal system, we're looking at it from that place, from the place of harm. And how do we mend that harm? So harm is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. From this violation, there's an obligation that has been created. And what's essential or central to that obligation is to, as much as possible, make it right by the people that have been harmed. Next slide, Thea. No worries. And so we're going to look at two different paradigms. So we're very familiar with the current legal approach, right? So we're looking at first we'll look at the current criminal legal approach, that paradigm. We may have seen it on popular programs, SVU. A lot of you folks on this discussion right now are part of the legal system. And so what are the questions that the legal system asks? And so they ask, what rule was broken? Who broke it? And what punishment do they deserve, or how will they be punished? If we shift to a restorative paradigm, we ask these questions. Who has been harmed? What do they need? And whose obligation is it to meet those needs, or to make it as right as possible? So if you look at the two different paradigms and you look at this set of questions, you notice something that's different about them. Within the legal system, we ask, the questions are centered around the rules, around the law. The restorative approach is centered around people, the person who's been harmed. And by centering people, by centering the harm and striving to make it as right as possible, that takes steps towards healing and creates a process for accountability. And so when thinking about restorative community conferencing, which is a process within the restorative justice diversion, this model of restorative community conferencing comes from family group conferencing in Aotearoa. And so this model comes from Aotearoa, which is commonly known as New Zealand. It's the Maori word for New Zealand, and Maori are the indigenous folks of Aotearoa. So in 1988, New Zealand's government commissioned a report, and it was to identify the practices and the policies that were creating disparities with Maori youth being incarcerated, and also being removed from the home, from the welfare system, as the judge spoke about earlier. The government took feedback from the community and began to use Maori-inspired restorative process, which is the family group conferencing model, to address harm and wrongdoing. After that year, in 1989, the Children, Young Person, and Their Families Act made family group conferencing made it the primary way to address harm done by young people, except the exceptions were for murder and manslaughter. And so after implementing restorative justice and family group conferencing, there was a huge reduction in youth incarceration rates. So after they did the study, they noticed the reduction in of youth being incarcerated, and yet, because there hadn't been a focus around racial and ethnic disparities, they also noticed that the disparity of Maori youth to non-Maori youth, it was still high. And so this provides us with information. So as we're designing programs, when we're talking about restorative justice, it's imperative from the beginning, during the process, and at the end, that we are vigilant about making sure that we keep racial and ethnic disparities at the forefront of reducing that, eliminating actually. Because if we're not, then yes, there can be a reduction with this case, and within Aotearoa, there can be a reduction, but the disparities can still increase. And so you'll hear more about the restorative community conferencing model and what are the specific things that are infused with it to make sure that that we are being mindful, that it's designed to address racial and ethnic disparities and to reduce and eventually eliminate that. And I'm sure you all have ideas as well, but you'll hear some from our presenters. And then the last thing, if you want more information about this, there's an amazing report put out. The link will be dropped in. It's New Zealand's Youth Justice Transformation, and it's called Lessons for the United States by the Juvenile Justice Network. So it's a fabulous read. They have great other ideas about how to really change and shift the paradigm to supporting youth and families.
I wanted to start off with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls, as well as a quantitative change in our lives. I wanted to start off with that quote because if you've heard from some of the other speakers, moving into a more relationship-centered effort to support our young people and their families. And at its core, restorative justice is all about relationships and is one of the reasons RYSE, as a community-based organization, has been pushing for restorative practices in our community. Building relationships with young people, how we're creating those relationships, how we're meeting them where they are, how we're maintaining those relationships, and how we're mending those relationships are important when we're working with them, as well as how we're advocating for them and building relationships with systems partners. So I just wanted to share a little bit about relationship because that's a crucial part of the process of having a restorative justice diversion program. So a little bit about the process that we use at RYSE. If a young person has harmed someone, we receive the case from our district attorney's office, and we know that it's met the baseline criteria for our program. Once we receive that case, our restorative practices specialists go over the case to see if it meets if it needs the rigor of the program. And one of the things that I think is important, especially when you're designing this program and really making it your own, just because a case may not fit the criteria for a restorative justice diversion program doesn't mean that you don't support that young person. And so one of the things that we've been fortunate as we've built the relationship with our systems partners is if that young person doesn't necessarily fit within the diversion program, how do we start looking at other supports for that young person so we can still divert them away from the system? And that's very important to think about when you're designing the program. This also isn't an easy process. It's not a quick process. There's a lot that goes into preparing the young person for the circle that's about to happen, working with the person that's been harmed on the circle that's about to happen, working with our community members and how they participate, and working with the different levels of supports that both the young person and the person harmed have. And when we're looking at this, we're meeting everyone where they are and really looking at how we can support them, not just with this particular situation, but are there any other places of need that they have, and how can we, if we can't do it in our organization, how do we leverage other relationships that we have with other organizations to support these different needs? Once the conference happens and a plan is prepared, it's not just the young person's the responsibility to ensure that that plan happens, but we look at how do we have to, what are the things that we need to put in place for that young person to really succeed in this? So an example of that, a young person that we worked with, they were going through a lot. And it led to them causing the particular harm that they caused. But through a lot of the conversations that our restorative practice specialists had with them, we started finding out some other things that were happening. Once we were able to kind of triage and really start working on these other things, we were able to provide that support system so that young person could successfully complete their plan. Next slide, please. So one of the things that, and I know it's going to be talked about a little bit after this, and I think in another session, but while we're looking at the behavior of a young person and looking at the harm that they've caused, it's also important for us to look at the behavior of our systems and look at how we need to transform those systems. So just a quick bit about RYSE, and then you can understand where I'm coming from. So RYSE was born out of youth organizing. It was built on youth and adult cross-sector partnerships, and it was created to address acute and structural violence. So some of the things that are important for us is that we're in service to young people and not systems. We prioritize relationships, we foster social and emotional health, and we foster social political development for our young people. And we always conduct a race and power analysis in all of the work that we do. So that's why it's very important that this particular program and how we envisioned it and how we implement it, it's really to disrupt this cycle, which in our eyes is a cycle of violence towards our communities. One of the things that we've been in partnership with the DA's office is really looking at what is the target area that we need to focus on. And so when we looked at data from our county, it was really two particular areas where young Black and brown people were being arrested at higher rates. They were being sentenced at higher rates. They were being incarcerated in our juvenile hall and our boys ranch at higher rates. We also saw that these particular areas were also suffering from or being pushed, having young people pushed out from some of the surrounding areas because of gentrification. And so those populations were growing and rising, and areas where they were moving that didn't necessarily have Black and brown populations were the ones that were being targeted and arrested at a higher frequency. Another thing that's very important is that there is no participation fee. None of the programs that we have at RYSE have a fee. Like I said, we're in service to young people, and we're working with young people that are used to not having different things or used to being looked at as second fiddle. And so it's important that we're able to provide services for them at no charge that are high-level services, that are services where they can not only get the mental health supports that they need by seeing one of our therapists on site, but they're also able to learn art. They're able to get education support, get job supports. So all of that is encompassed within our programs. Another thing that I think is important and where we found success is that, and this is kind of going into the behavior of systems, it's important to look at the trauma that systems have inflicted on our communities, and not just the criminal legal system, but even nonprofits. And so one of the things that is very important to us is how RYSE as an organization moves within our county. So for instance, as a representative of RYSE, I'm the co-chair of the county's racial justice oversight body, which specifically looks at the racial and ethnic disparities within our criminal legal system. Being on our racial equity office and pushing for what that looks like. Being on different mental health support system bodies within our county to ensure that our communities are getting the supports that they deserve. And so we strategically put ourselves in these different positions so that we can advocate for the policies and practices that our young people need and deserve. And not only that, but we look at how we're building the capacity of our young people to be able to navigate their own liberation and push for those same policies and practices. And so that looks like ensuring that there's always a youth voice at the table and making sure that we're not just the adults that are talking for them, but we're with them in their advocacy. Next slide. So our program is diverting young folks at pre-charge, we're working not only with us, but we're working with other organizations and building with other organizations and really making this a community effort to surround the young person and the person harmed to ensure that they're getting their needs. And the staff that works at RYSE, the majority, our organization is a majority person of color organization. The majority of our leadership are women of color. Many, I think about a third of our staff are from the community. And so that's very important when working with young people in our community, is to know that the people that are working with them are from the same area, may not necessarily have gone through the same things, but they're seeing people that look like them and have been in some of the same situations, and they feel comfortable and can work with them. And that's from leadership to our therapists. And we've seen a difference in how our young people work with us in this process.
Thanks, Stephanie. Okay, so this is the latest data that we have on just some of the many benefits of pre-charge restorative justice diversion. So the graph on the left shows data from San Francisco that was published in 2019. And as you can see, youth who completed restorative justice diversion were 4 times less likely to recidivate or cause more harm at least 2 years after completing the program, compared to similarly situated young people who were charged and whose cases were processed through San Francisco's juvenile legal system. And on the right, you can see restorative justice diversion is significantly cheaper, right? So it costs just under $6,000 for a case from start to finish for restorative justice, compared to, for instance, $266,000 to hold a young person in San Francisco's juvenile detention center. And then finally, in terms of data, again, because this model is centered around the needs of people harmed, 91% of survivors who participated in the restorative justice diversion process and completed an evaluation at the end of that process said that they would participate in a similar process or would recommend that process to a friend. And then before we open this up to the Q&A, and I know we're kind of running short on time, we just wanted to make really clear that, kind of taking a step back for a second, we can't ask people of color, especially Black and Indigenous folks, to hold themselves accountable for harm that they've caused without society, ideally first, taking responsibility for causing centuries of harm and creating the conditions that perpetuate interpersonal harm, especially within communities of color. And so, full disclosure, this is something that we at Impact Justice are still figuring out how to do with sites that we work with, especially given our small team and our capacity. But we just wanted to state that if you are interested in implementing a restorative justice diversion program in your community, you need to ideally first have truth and reconciliation processes that, similar to Rwanda, similar to processes in Canada and in plenty of other countries, that in a very public manner, tell the full story and history of your community and our country more generally, and really detailing the full extent of the atrocities committed against especially Black and Indigenous people. And in doing that, it's important to avoid framing Black and Indigenous people as victims, right? But instead really presenting us as the resilient and resourceful survivors that we are. And that's especially important for younger generations of Black and Indigenous folks to understand the strength and the brilliance that they come from, and that their lineage is rooted in it. That truth telling is all part of the process of disrupting the cycle of harm caused both by society and by individuals. And then it's not important, and then it's not enough to stop there, right? So just like the Restorative Justice Diversion Program that Stephanie just described for interpersonal harm, you then need to address the needs and that are a direct result of centuries of harm. And in doing that, you need to make sure that you have, again, Black and Indigenous people leading that process of both identifying the needs and then creating that plan to address those needs. And then a final note is that it's crucial that at every step of the way, you make sure to involve all of the necessary stakeholders in this process in order to avoid unintentionally causing additional harm, right? So just, as an example, programs offering small business grants or loans targeting certain low-income communities of color are great, but can also be implemented in ways that actually just contribute to gentrification. So you really want to make sure that along the way, you're involving all the stakeholders and constantly checking to make sure that you're not actually just going to be causing more harm in terms of, implementing and actually addressing needs that have come out of centuries of societal and community harm. And with that, we're going to stop there and spend the next 14 minutes or so answering questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Sia. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Judge Calloway, for sharing those gems with us about restorative justice, about things that we can do, what's working well at the site level, and what's to come in the future, and what, as a collective, do we need to do around truth, reconciliation, and accountability. So with that, there was a question. Judge Calloway, this one's going to be for you. And it's around where we're at with COVID. So it says, is there data sharing around COVID and how it's impacting things such as exclusionary punishment or consequences for Black and Brown students? What's the long-term impact that you think that it will have around distance learning? Or maybe what's the long-term impact that you think COVID may have with our youth?
So I am not aware of the current data as to how COVID relates to exclusionary discipline. I will say, at least in Nashville, Tennessee, that the amount of exclusionary discipline has been very low because no one's going to school. Although we are keeping up with truancy rates, everyone has to log in every day. The actual, excluding from the school system is not the same as it was pre-COVID. Now, having said that, we have lots of concerns with the quality of engagement with students, particularly those who are in minority communities or communities that don't have regular access to Wi-Fi and regular access to good working computers or supportive structured people that can help navigate those types of electronics for our students. So we have a lot of concerns about what's going to happen after COVID and where the education gap, is it going to be a lot larger than it was going pre-COVID? And I think that probably is something that we all have to recognize. We're fortunate enough in Nashville to have a brand new school district or school person over the schools, superintendent, who understands. She's a young black woman who actually grew up in the school system, and she understands how disparities work. She understands the issues of social and emotional learning, and she and her staff are preparing how to deal with it once students come back in person. On the flip side, we're also very concerned with the incidences of child abuse and other things that could be happening that are causing trauma to our youth that are going unheard of or going unseen because they're not being seen by the school system. And so there's a flip side on both sides, and we definitely have concerns about how all of our youth are going to survive through COVID. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, for a lot of communities across this nation, being aware of, we're gonna have to be very aware and proactive about how we're going to support our young people, our families, and how we can continue to make the change that we've started to make thus far. Stephanie, I'm gonna go to a question for you. So this is a question regarding the RYSE program. And how do you have participation data? How do you get people to commit to the entire restorative process? And can you share some of the common principles that you have around the restorative justice circles or the restorative justice conferences? How do you get engagement, folks to engage?
Sure. So I think, well, for the restorative justice program, we're fairly new. We've always implemented restorative practices in everything that we do at RYSE. So we're slowly getting our data specifically with that program. But some of the principles that we use, and we use this throughout the whole process, so not just at the culminating circle, but when we're engaging with the young person from the beginning, the young person and the person harmed from the beginning, and the community, but establishing values. Generally just explaining what the process is. And really, one of the things about building relationship is to find out about that person. And so our specialists are learning about the young person, learning about the person harmed. And what they do is take those principles of the relationship that they've been doing individually, looking at the values that they've talked about individually, and really preparing them in a way so they can talk about those things once they get to the circle. And same sentiments with, a regular circle process, using a talking piece, establishing guidelines for how to be in the circle that everyone agrees on. And so those are just a few things. And I think there was another question in there. Did I miss it?
I think that was this. It was around data collection, engagement, and you mentioned both of those, and like, what are the ways that you build into the process?
Yeah, and definitely, I don't have like specific data to give right now, but that is something that we're doing, is collecting data. I mean, that's a very important thing. That's also another thing that we've pushed, not even just with diversion, but within our county. What's the data that they're collecting on the young people and the adults in the criminal legal system? And then how are we using that data? Because sometimes it can be non-existent, or either we just don't see it.
Thank you. And thank you for highlighting the importance of data and collecting the data from the beginning, and how that is a way to be thoughtful about in the design when addressing racial and ethnic disparities. Sia, I have a question for you. This is going to be a two-part question. The questions are a little bit different. We get this question often as well. It's like, so what's the difference between restorative justice and transformative justice? And then, is it possible to do restorative justice or a model like this post-charge?
Oh, wait, we don't have enough time. So basically, in a nutshell, restorative justice is essentially this process that RYSE has taken on. And it's basically the process of so backing up a little bit, restorative justice isn't just for addressing harm, but in the context of this conversation, in the interest of time, if you think about restorative justice as being the approach that you use when you're addressing that interpersonal harm, whereas transformative justice is kind of more of an umbrella that has elements of restorative justice, has elements of restorative approaches, but it's taking that step back further that I just spoke about, in terms of really looking at societal harm and addressing the real underlying causes, or radical, as Angela Davis says, just meaning grabbing issues at the root, right? Really addressing the root causes of things. So it's one thing when someone robs someone and you address the harm that comes out of that robbery. And it's another thing when you're addressing the centuries of intergenerational wealth that's been built on the backs of Black folks in this country, right? And then addressing the realities of that have contributed to that robbery. So kind of in a jumbly nutshell, it's kind of the difference between restorative justice and transformative justice, at least when we're talking about addressing harm. I think the other question was about post-charge restorative justice. So there are examples, there are certainly models that I'm sure many of you have heard of. in this country that are currently operating. There are places that are currently operating post-charge restorative justice diversion programs. Again, in the interest of time, I will just say that that is not ideal. And so, and the issue there is that, again, restorative justice is a paradigm shift from our current system. And so the further someone gets into our current criminal legal system, the more harm you are necessarily causing. That's just a fact. And so the idea about doing pre-charge restorative justice approaches is that you're, first of all, keeping someone as much out of the system as possible. So maybe they're still being arrested, which the end goal is to have community referrals where people aren't calling the police in the first place. But for right now, keeping people as much out of the system as possible before they're ever charged with a crime. So to avoid all of the harm that you would cause if they get further into the system. It's also, though, again, about honoring the needs of people harmed, right? And so there are tons of people, I think that we are told in terms of like the mainstream media and different things like that, that there's one kind of survivor, right? There's one type of person who is victimized and that they're super punitive and that they want that person locked up and throw away the key. And what we find is that everyone is different. All survivors need different things, and very few of them are actually punitive in the sense that we think that they are, at least at least in terms of the current system. And so there are plenty of people who are harmed, and what they really want is to be safe again. What they really want is for the harm that occurred to them to not occur to anyone else. And when you look at the, even just like the recidivism rates, not just bring it back to data of our current system, that you're not going to get, as a survivor, you're not going to get what you want if what you want is less harm in your community, and for that to not happen again to someone else. You're not going to get that the further you send someone into our system. And so by allowing people to engage in restorative justice processes pre-charge, you're actually truly honoring the needs of people harmed, as opposed to letting the system do its thing first and then having restorative justice as kind of like an afterthought. And then you're also doing justice, whatever justice means, right? You're doing a much better service to the person who has also caused harm. So it's kind of in a nutshell without having more time.
Thank you, Sia. I really appreciate that. Like, you hit all of the both points. So thank you for sharing that. There were some questions around training and like, how do you get this funded, and what are the different types of cases that you can do, and how long do cases take in the restorative community? Restorative community conferencing. And so some of that information can be found on our toolkit. So we'll drop the toolkit in the chat for y'all. There's in the toolkit, there's a funding piece where it talks about that. Ideally, communities can get funded philanthropically, and then the federal and municipal supports can come in, and we can really shift and divert money towards restorative justice. That is the goal. Training. Impact Justice has just launched a national training and innovation center. And so we'll be doing trainings, and we're excited to be working and continue to be in partnership with folks with JDI Connect, with Judge Calloway and the Davidson County, with amazing community-based organizations such as RYSE. If you have not checked out their website, you have to go see their website. Stephanie kind of scratched the surface about the values. When you read those values, you're like, okay, I see what y'all are talking about. So I highly suggest that you look them up, reach out to the folks on this panel, on this webinar, and get more information. We were only able to go here, y'all, and we know y'all want to go here, but we can do that at a different time. Before we close, I just want to say thank you. Thank you I saw all the different places across the nation of folks where you're at. So thank you for shouting where you're at. Thank you for joining us today, for your amazing questions. We will be able to answer those questions on the JDAI Connect. The webinar will be posted there, the recording, also the slides. It'll be within 24 hours, so feel free to continue the discussion. And then February 15th, lock in the date, y'all. There's a part 2 to this discussion. We are going to talk about why it is essential to have restorative justice held within the community. So if you enjoyed this conversation, you definitely want to come back for part 2. Can't thank you all enough Brian, Bree, the folks who helped us with the captions, all of y'all, this is just amazing. This is really, 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 really great. And like we talked about accountability and truth and reconciliation, we got to continue to do it for our Black, Brown, Indigenous youth, for our youth of color, for our LGBTQ youth, for all of the folks on the margins. We have to continue to fight because we cannot continue to do harm to our communities. So let's continue this fight. Let's continue this discussion. Thank you, February 17th. I see that in there. I appreciate y'all. With that, Brian, I'm gonna hand it to you. I think I'm done.